Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
I go into the specific allegations labeled against UNRWA. I wanted to lay down a couple of things, if you could, for our audience, about one of the allegations that has been, and it's surprising because a lot of places you see UNRWA, UN operating actually, but you don't see UN textbooks like UNRWA has those prescribed textbooks being followed. Lay down for our audience why UNRWA actually prescribe this textbook, and some of them even are followed in Jerusalem as much as closest to Israel.
Right. So UNRWA is obviously, it's a very unique organization in the sphere of the United Nations and the humanitarian sphere, in that it performs a role for the Palestinians that's in many ways more akin to that of a government than of a humanitarian organization. Whereas the main UN refugee agency focuses on providing aid and helping refugees resettle or find other places to live or return if possible, which is just one of the options available for most refugees. UNRWA has taken on roles far beyond that, including education. And this has been going on for many, many, many decades. They provide not all of the schools in the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, but they do run a large number of schools in those territories and in the refugee camps, if you can call them refugee camps. And these schools adopt as many have pointed out, they adopt a curriculum that is in some ways it's a normal curriculum, of course. They're teaching students math and science, but the problem is that the curriculum and the teaching materials are often filled with incitement that has been pushed in by extremist actors in Palestinian society, all with the knowledge of the officials at UNRWA. They understand what's going on in the textbooks, and instead of just teaching math, the math questions will be more along the lines of, if a resistance fighter kills 5 Jews and then kills another 3 Jews, how many Jews are dead? So even in these kind of seemingly benign education topics of something like math, anti-Semitism and incitement is a feature of this education. So the unique role that UNRWA has taken in the Palestinian issue, in these sort of governmental roles, it is not serving as a positive force in these governmental roles. It's acting in many ways the same as the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank or Hamas in Gaza, in terms of helping fuel the hatred and incitement.
And I want to go into the specific details about, I read your article, and we had one of the other speakers as well mentioning the very definition of how they define a refugee also plays a role into it, because they inflate the number, and there are a lot of people settled in the States or in the UK, and they're still a refugee, even though they are earning billions of dollars. So could you define for us or lay out what exactly the definition of a refugee in terms of how UNRWA defines it, and why they do inflate the numbers in the first place?
Right. So the way UNRWA defines refugee, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but it's essentially those Palestinian Arabs who were displaced in 1948, where those territories were their normal place of residence for, I think it was 2 years prior. Over the years, and that's a relatively normal definition of what is a refugee, but they expanded that definition over the years. And so in 1982, the United Nations adopted a resolution which essentially made every single male descendant on the paternal side of someone who fit that original definition, they would automatically be considered a refugee for purposes of UNRWA. And this is completely unique. It is, of course, possible for a descendant to become a refugee in the definition used by the UN's main refugee agency, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But it's not automatic. And it has to fit a certain set of conditions in order for a descendant to become a refugee, namely that they're still living like a refugee. And this sort of gets to the heart of the issue of the definition, because whereas the normal treatment of refugees is to help alleviate their humanitarian situation, for UNRWA, it has become a tool of instead perpetuating a conflict by keeping the Palestinian Arabs refugees perpetually. So you have a situation where, for example, Gigi Hadid, the millionaire model in the United States with American citizenship, is considered a refugee, which is, of course, absurd. It serves no other purpose than to keep a political situation, a political cause alive, that political cause being this idea that the Palestinian Arabs will one day return to their homes in Israel and be able to get rid of the state that way. But it sort of shows the whole kind of politicization and in many ways moral perversion of this whole treatment of the refugee issue, because it harms the Palestinians themselves the most. And we can sort of see this this double standard in a way that Palestinian refugees are treated compared to any other refugee by the issue of Palestinians in Gaza not being allowed to escape through Egypt. There's this sort of bizarre international consensus that they cannot be allowed to leave Gaza. And that is if this was any other situation, that would be considered not just immoral, but illegal. States are obligated to provide asylum for those escaping a place like Gaza, which is undergoing war. And yet we've decided that we're going to see it differently in this one situation, and thus making the conflict worse, making the situation worse for the Palestinian Arabs.
And I wanted to understand here, like, if you create a refugee mentality and a psyche that you would want to return, knowing that probably you were displaced someday, doesn't that inherently create a certain sense of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism in the first place? Because you would have children growing up with the mentality that there is an occupation by a foreign force.
Yes, exactly. And that's part of it's an excellent point, because it helps expose, again, the political nature of UNRWA. It must be said that this is not an agency, this is not a humanitarian agency, this is fundamentally a political agency. And you can see it in its mission, because they are perpetuating this idea that the only way for this conflict to resolve is through this political solution of all the Palestinians being able to return to their homes that they've never lived in Israel. And this is not a humanitarian gesture. If it was a humanitarian gesture, then why is this not applied to every other refugee situation, every other similar situation? And by helping feed this narrative that the only just outcome of this conflict that's been going on for decades and decades is for them to return to their homes that, again, most of them never lived in and have no connection to, is to feed that narrative that the Jewish people in Israel are not the true owners, the true residents of the land. And in that way, that's part of the problem with a lot of the textbooks that have been exposed from the UNRWA schools, in that they feed into this narrative that the Jewish Israeli people are aliens who don't belong in the land.
And a lot of countries who are actually funding UNRWA in some sort of a way uh, do that because they believe that it's a humanitarian organization which provides aid and assistance. Could you lay down how much of the UNRWA's budget is allocated for education, and roughly how much goes for the aid part of it?
I don't have the exact split between how much goes to education, how much goes to aid. I do know that there is an enormous difference in terms of the allocation to these categories of expenditure between UNRWA and the main UN refugee agency. And it's worth exploring, because you have a situation in which there's, in terms of the number of dollars and the number of staff devoted to the two agencies on a per capita basis, per refugee basis, there is several times more staff and several times more dollars per refugee under UNRWA than there is for refugees under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the main refugee agency. And much of this money is obviously not going towards the kind of main purpose of what a refugee agency should be: providing shelter, providing food for people that have been recently displaced and need somewhere new to go, somewhere safe to go. Instead, most of this money is going toward schools to teach, unfortunately, the incitement that we're finding, and to perform all these other kind of political roles. And you can sort of see this in this latest conflict about how much money they're really spending on PR, for example. So hopefully that answers. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact numbers with me.
Yeah, that's the reason. The reason why I asked you, because I was reading an article as well where you mentioned about CNN's coverage. I want to come to that as well, because when we look at the international media or countries who provides aid to UNRWA, they provide aid because they believe that it's an organization which works with humanitarian assistance, and often the part of education is often neglected. On your coverage, or since camera does kind of work by the track anti-Semitism, I want to understand that what was international media's coverage seemingly look like when they covered UNRWA, especially when they realized a few days back when the IDF discovered a tunnel right inside UNRWA's headquarters.
Right. The media coverage in general has not been great. And part of this, what the cause is, who knows? It could be that a lot of these journalists simply aren't familiar with the conflict, and they don't understand the background and history that UNRWA has. And so you find that the coverage misses a lot of important context that needs to be given for people to really understand what is happening. So, for example, with the recent discovery of the Hamas tunnel headquarters underneath the UNRWA headquarters, that's a very significant find, but it is not the first by any means. And you can go back many, many, many decades to see that these kinds of incidents have been occurring and have yet to be fixed. For example, in 1982, Israel found a school in southern Lebanon that was being used by the then head of the terrorist organization, Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, as a training facility for terrorists. And of course, you can see from all the previous wars, there have been many incidents of the agency being forced to admit that it has found weapons or tunnels in its facilities. For example, I remember in July 2014, during Operation Protective Edge, UNRWA was forced to admit 3 times in just 1 month that it found weapons in its schools. Then in 2017, twice they were forced to admit that they found tunnels under their schools. In 2020, they found more weapons in a school. In 2021, another tunnel was found in a school. In sometime in 2022, yet again, they found another tunnel under their school. This is a pattern, and this has been ongoing. And even during this conflict, there's a lot of stories, and some of them get missed, but the same thing is occurring in this conflict again. In November, they found a tunnel next to a UNRWA school in Beit Hanun. They found rocket launchers located next to another UNRWA school. They found how many weapons and explosives hidden inside UNRWA bags. This context is often missing from the coverage of what's going on. And the other context that's unfortunately often missing is the credibility of UNRWA's leadership. And I think it's important to point out to audience members that, of course, after this tunnel network was found underneath the UNRWA headquarters, the head of the agency, Philippe Lazzarini, claimed they didn't know. Well, that's been their standard go-to, is they claim they didn't know, or they claim that the people making these claims are just trying to slander the agency. But they have been, how do I put it? They've been caught doing this many times of claiming that they didn't know, and promising, oh, we'll look into it, and then nothing ever changes. I recall there was a report about 2 decades ago from the State Department, it was the State Department. There was a report in the United States. There's a Government Accountability Office, which sort of acts as an auditing institution. And they looked into our aid to UNRWA, and they basically found these exact problems. And they warned that there's some very serious issues with providing aid to UNRWA because it is very open to being exploited by terrorist organizations. And they did nothing to fix it. And then when they're finally forced to when there's enough political pressure, sometimes they'll try to cover it up with half measures to address it that don't really address the issue. There was another report from the same office, the Government Accountability Office from the State Department, where in 2017, there were some issues that got enough media attention regarding the anti-Semitism in textbooks in their schools. And UNRWA said, oh, we'll look into it, and we're going to create some different teaching materials, and everything is going to be great. But the GAO, when they looked into it, they found that, number one, they never actually trained the teachers on this new material. And number two, they never even distributed the new teaching material. And the reason why this kind of context is important is because the media consumers, they need to understand the credibility of these claims coming from UNRWA. You can't just treat these stories as he said, she said. Yes, you need to provide the audience with both perspectives, but you also need to ensure your audience understands relative credibility of these statements and issues that reflect on the credibility coming from these various parties. And that's what they're failing to do. And I think a lot of that comes from the general lack of historical knowledge from a lot of journalists.
And it's important because in the article as well, you mentioned how CNN's interview with the former Director General of UNRWA, Chris, played an important role. And I wanted to understand that while you have certain people who come out on media and start parroting the exact narrative that what Israel is saying, it's a lie, how much of that seep into the public mind and create a general sense that what Israel is saying is propaganda or a certain sense of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's difficult because the United Nations is in general, not just UNRWA, but in general is an organization in which there is a general positive association with, in that people look at the United Nations and, oh, it's devoted to peace, it's devoted to human rights, and so when they hear something from a United Nations official or someone defending the United Nations, there tends to be that positive bias towards what they are saying. And this is, of course, problematic because the anyone who has really looked into these issues, who really understands that history, will understand that these are kind of self-serving political propaganda talking points. And unfortunately at UNRWA in particular, it's in many ways, as I said, it's fundamentally a political organization, and in many ways it's also, it sees one of its top priorities as public relations. And you can see this in the way they respond to controversies, in that instead of responding seriously to serious accusations and saying we'll look into it and we don't tolerate this, instead you see them repeatedly send out their officials or send out former officials like Chris Guinness, who used to be the Director General, to slander those who are making these charges. And you see in particular in relation to the work of UN Watch, whenever they produce reports detailing some of the awful things going on at the agency, the leadership of UNRWA responds by accusing UN Watch of engaging in a smear campaign, even though they never actually dispute the evidence actually provided by UN Watch. And this was, kind of on display in full comedic effect with the revelation a month or two ago of the Telegram channel that was being operated by UNRWA staff, where I don't remember how many, I think it was well over 1,000 staff members were posting incitement and anti-Semitism and glorifying the attacks of October 7th. And it was very clear that these were actually UNRWA staff members, and instead they sent out their PR professionals to claim that, oh, well, you can't actually prove that they are our staff members. Of course, then UN Watch produced more evidence proving, yes, absolutely, these are UN staff members, and they chose after that to just ignore. And so there's this kind of well-honed PR machine that is also, unfortunately, fueled by a somewhat natural human tendency in a conflict like this for journalists and media organizations to want to focus on some of the heart-wrenching images. What's going to get more attention from media consumers? A picture of a bombed-out building, or some boring lecture about corruption in an agency that they don't really understand. There's a lot of history. So it's unfortunately, there's a difference in terms of if I may say, the sexiness of the topics that has a bias towards some of the talking points that the UNRWA staff would rather us focus on instead of their misdeeds.
For example, in a country like India, where you have a lot of young people in university campuses who aren't anti-Semitic, as probably where you see the American universities would be, but have no clue about UNRWA textbooks, what the content is. like I saw the report by Impact SC where they studied the textbooks of UNRWA textbooks, and they laid out the detail, as you mentioning, the horrific, like I saw the Newton's second law being explained by a mass Palestinian throwing a stone, and I fail to understand what stops like Israel or the campaign actually to put this in the media and show to the young people of what UNRWA is, because the problem is that the overwhelming number of reports that seeps into when you Google UNRWA will not be UNRWA textbooks, but Israel is cutting down, or America is cutting down funds to UNRWA actually.
Yeah, it sort of gets back to the topic of how there's a varying degree in terms of the sexiness of topics. In that war in general and conflict and death gets more attention than some of the fundamental underlying causes of that war, of that conflict. And the issue of education, it's unfortunately for the general audience, it tends to seem more disconnected. There's more layers between it than just understanding the harm that's happening during the war. And it's not a simple explanation to explain. It's sort of counterintuitive how deep of an issue it really is in Palestinian society, this incitement, because people in America, people in India, we're not used to that. That's very different than how we grew up. In our schools, we're taught tolerance. In our schools, we're taught, war is not a good thing. Unfortunately, that's not what is happening in a lot of these schools in places like Gaza and the West Bank under UNRWA's, direction. And because of that, because people tend to project their own, cultural sensibilities onto the world events, it's hard for them to really comprehend it. It's difficult, and that means, eventually well-intended people, educated people, intelligent people, they can dismiss this kind of evidence because it just doesn't make sense to them, because they don't have the background to really put into context what is happening. So it's difficult for the general audience to really put this in perspective, but it's unfortunately so important for people to understand what is going on, and for people to understand how they can help contribute towards ending the conflict, because the issues are not simple, they're not straightforward, they're not exactly easy to digest. Unfortunately, reality is often, it's not neat, it's complex, it's dirty, it's messy. There's a lot of very difficult choices that need to be made. But it only causes harm if people decide to ignore it or decide not to look into it and base their opinions without kind of that full awareness of what's really going on, including in terms of inciting populations involved in a conflict. That's only going to harm the people involved more, because it helps fuel wrong assumptions and wrong calculations by the parties themselves. I fundamentally believe that one of the main reasons why the conflict has lasted this long is because the international community has continued to act in a way that suggests to the extremists in Hamas and Islamic Jihad and their supporters that all they have to do is continue the conflict, and the international community will continue to pressure Israel to force it to give up. And then once Israel gives up its security, then they can finish their mission of destroying the Jewish state and take all of it, as is made very clear, not just in their charter, but in all their public statements. Now, of course, that's not what's going to happen. The people of Israel are not going to give up. They have nowhere else to go. This is their homeland. And by fueling this frankly, delusion the international community is only causing more suffering to both sides. That's why we keep having conflicts, because there's this miscalculation on the part of the Palestinians that they just need to hold out. The international community will force Israel at some point. And that's not what I want to see happen. That's not what anyone should want to see happen. Nobody wants to see the Palestinians continuing to suffer, nor the Israelis continue to suffer.
So one of the big charges actually labeled by the national community when you want to defund an organization like UNRWA is that it will affect the humanitarian assistance that's going, or the aid going to Gaza. And I want to understand here that if, let's say, the countries start defunding UNRWA for what it has done, can this humanitarian assistance projects still reach to the Gazan people through some other means?
Yes, absolutely. And some of the other UN agencies have said so, that they are perfectly capable of scaling up their efforts in order to deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. You don't need UNRWA to do it. And frankly, it's when you're relying on UNRWA to do it, you're relying on an inefficient organization that is only helping to fuel the conflict and create the need for more aid, both currently and in the future, by failing to really act as a true humanitarian organization. So it's really a nonsense argument, and it's one that is, again, based in politics, not in humanitarian considerations. There's no reason that we can't instead give that money to an organization like, say, the World Food Program, which has been delivering food aid to places that UNRWA hasn't been in Gaza, including northern Gaza. I recall just a week ago when Israel pointed out UNRWA was putting out this kind of propaganda saying, oh, the Israelis are preventing us from going to northern Gaza and giving them food, and they're going to starve. And the Israeli authorities pointed out just 2 days ago, we helped facilitate a large World Food Program convoy to deliver food to northern Gaza. And so it's perfectly possible for these other agencies. It's demonstrably possible. And frankly, that's the route we should be going.
And while we're talking all about this, there are a couple of last questions that I have, and one of them I want to understand is, it's very convenient for UNRWA to get away saying that we didn't know that this happened, or we are investigating. When you say that 12 members were directly associated in the October 7 massacre, and over 1,200 people were somehow associated with Hamas, and you have a Hamas data center right underneath your headquarters, and you have seen power cables actually literally going inside from the top floor to the ground floor, how can you not know? And also, how can you not know what is been taught in the textbooks in your own UNRWA-run schools?
Yeah, frankly, there's no way they couldn't have known. And whether Philippe Lazzarini himself knew, I don't know. But there's no way that UNRWA as an organization, as an institution, did not know this was happening at its headquarters at some level. And there's a lot to be said about willful blindness in this conflict from organizations like UNRWA. At a certain point, as you say, it's not possible to say that you couldn't have known. When you see cables going down into the ground and you don't know where they're going, and you know that there's this history of Hamas building tunnels underneath UNRWA institutions, you can't possibly claim ignorance. Now, the bigger issue with education, they know, and you can tell that they know by the way that they respond to these crises, because whenever there is a controversy about some anti-Semitism in the textbooks, what ends up happening is if there's enough pressure, as I said earlier, they say, oh, well, we'll fix something, we'll create some new materials. But then it ends up getting exposed one way or another, that those materials never actually reached the people that were supposed to. They were never actually trained on those materials. And that is an act by UNRWA itself. They know it's not being accomplished because they know they're not doing it themselves. And they know that there was the problem because that's what prompted them to engage in these sort of whitewashing efforts of these deeply problematic issues of incitement and anti-Semitism. So one, again, you'd only kind of look at the history of this organization and the controversies to understand that efforts to proclaim ignorance are just simply nonsense.
We see in the German society when there was a height of anti-Semitism and there was a certain sense of denazification done over the years. When we look at the similar structure of the textbooks having this anti-Semitic content, Israel might win the war, get control over Gaza, but do you think there could be some sort of a denazification in those textbooks to actually make those children what you see this rise of anti-Semitism in the school textbooks? Some sort of way you could denazify those as well.
Yeah. Solving that issue is going to be difficult, and I don't know what the answer is because in part it depends on what is going to be the post-war situation in Gaza. And we do know that the state of Israel has said, essentially, we're not going to allow UNRWA to continue to exist after this war. What we replace the education with, there's a number of interesting options that have been proposed. I think it's important to realize, or to state right off the bat that there's not going to be a quick solution. There's been generations of incitement taught and anti-Semitism taught in these schools, and that's not going to be erased overnight. Some of the options I think are interesting if politically possible, such as using textbooks and teaching materials and some kind of cooperation with more moderate Arab countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. That could play a very positive role in changing the culture of education in a place like Gaza and in the West Bank. And I'm optimistic about that potential solution. And I hope something like that happens. Whether those countries are willing to is another question, because one thing we've learned throughout history is that the Arab countries are very interested in speaking about the conflict, but not as interested in helping resolve it. So it remains to be seen whether there's a political will on the part of those kind of players that could play that positive role in changing that situation on the ground. Absent that, you might have to resort to less preferable option of relying on some kind of reformed Palestinian Authority. But that would require a lot more oversight by donor countries and by other interested parties to make sure that the changes being made are actually being made. Because one thing we can't allow to happen is what we've seen happen with UNRWA, where we've known that there's been a problem and we've allowed it to continue unimpeded for generations, and now we're seeing the consequences.
Well, that's all the question that I have. So thank you so much for taking your time and speaking with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I had fun. Those were some really, really interesting questions.